The morning Gideon War rode into Harlan Creek, the sky above the Beartooth Mountains was the color of an old wound, gray at the edges, pale and bruised toward the middle, the kind of sky that did not promise anything good and had stopped pretending otherwise. He came down from Copper Ridge the way he always came down, alone, unhurried. His Appaloosa, a broad-chested animal named Soot, with a disposition somewhere between stubborn and loyal, picked its way along the frozen mud of the trail with the patience of a creature that had learned not to rush a man who never rushed. Gideon sat straight in the saddle the way men sit when they have spent years with no one watching them, when posture becomes habit, and habit becomes the only thing that does not change with the seasons. He was a large man, not the kind of large that announces itself loudly, that swaggers through doorways and slaps backs and fills rooms with noise. He was the kind of large that simply existed the way a ridge exists, the way an old pine exists, taking up its space without apology and without performance. 6 feet and 4 inches of bone and muscle, shaped by a decade of splitting wood in temperatures that frosted a man's beard before he finished his morning coffee. His hands resting easy on the reins were wide across the knuckles and rough along every surface with scars that had their own stories and had long since stopped needing to tell them. His jaw carried the kind of beard that grew because he had better things to do than shave dark and thick and streaked near the chin with early gray that had come in his 30s and decided to stay. His eyes were pale blue, the particular pale blue of high-altitude sky in January, the kind of color that sees a great distance without appearing to look at anything at all. He came to town 4 times a year. Salt, lead, flour. Occasionally a new length of rope or a bottle of something to help a winter evening pass without conversation. He did not stay longer than he had to. He did not explain this to anyone because no one in Harlan Creek was close enough to him to warrant an explanation. Today was different only in one regard, and that regard was entirely his own. Today was the 17th of November, which was the anniversary of the day he had stood in a field 8 years ago and made a choice that had unmade everything that followed. He did not observe the date with ceremony. He did not visit a grave. He simply made himself come down from the mountain and stand among people for a few hours, because the alternative was to sit inside his own head on the one day of the year when his own head was the most dangerous place he could be. He tied Soot at the rail outside Dottie Marsh's general store, which was also the post office, and also in the back room behind a curtain of flour sacks, the place where Dottie sold the best apple pie in 100 miles and charged 3 times what it was worth because she could. He meant to go inside. He meant to buy his salt and his lead, exchange 4 words with Dottie, who would exchange 6 back, and then return to the ridge before the gray sky made good on its silent threats. He was 3 steps from the door when he heard it. Not the noise first. The noise had been there since he came around the last bend in the trail, a low collective sound like the town was holding a conversation with itself, murmuring and shifting the way a crowd murmurs when it has gathered for something it finds entertaining. He had noted it and dismissed it. Towns did things. People gathered. It was not his concern. What stopped him was not the noise of the crowd. It was the voice beneath it, a single voice, a woman's voice. Low and tight like a string wound too far, and the words were not words he could make out at this distance, but the shape of the sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of someone talking to themselves in a moment of extremity, the kind of private words a person says when they are trying to hold themselves together by the force of their own quiet insistence. He had said words like that himself in fields and in winter cabins, and in one particular moment 8 years ago that he had spent every day since either trying to forget or trying to understand. He stood at the rail with one hand on Soot's neck and listened to that sound and felt something move in his chest that was not quite an emotion and not quite a memory, but lived somewhere between the two. Then the sound was swallowed back into the crowd noise, and there was only the collective murmur again. Gideon stood still for another 3 seconds. Then he turned away from Dottie's door and walked toward the center of town. The crowd had gathered in the square, which was not much of a square, more of a widening in the main road where the town had never quite decided what to put. There were perhaps 60 people, which was a significant portion of Harlan Creek's entire population, arranged in a rough half-circle facing a raised platform that had been used for public announcements, and once for a traveling preacher who had lasted 4 days before deciding the people of Harlan Creek were beyond saving and moved on to easier territory. Gideon stopped at the rear edge of the crowd. People noticed him the way people always noticed him, with the peripheral awareness of animals who have registered something larger than themselves entering their vicinity. A few shifted sideways. A gap opened, not because anyone stepped back deliberately, but because the human body makes small accommodations it is not always conscious of making. He could see the platform clearly now. A man in a brown coat stood to one side of it, speaking with the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to filling silence with sound. This was the auctioneer, a traveling figure named Hoskins, whom Gideon had seen before, a lean man with a habit of gesturing with both hands as though he were conducting music only he could hear. Beside him stood another man whom Gideon recognized as Warren Aldine, a man who ran a modest ranch operation south of town, and whom Gideon had spoken to perhaps twice in his life, both times briefly, and without any particular impression being made on either side. Warren Aldine stood with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance, which is the posture of a man who is waiting for something unpleasant to conclude. He had the look of a man performing patience for an audience, though the performance was not especially convincing. On the platform itself, standing slightly forward and alone, was a figure in a rough-spun dress the color of old clay, with a coarse burlap sack pulled over her head. Gideon looked at the figure and felt the crowd noise retreat to some middle distance. He had heard of this practice. He had never seen it. In the territories, particularly in the smaller and more isolated settlements, it had a grim and not entirely respectable history. The arrangement by which a woman whose circumstances had brought her to some edge of desperation, or whose family had brought her there without her consent, was offered for marriage to whatever man would have her. It was called different things in different places. None of the names were flattering. None of them, in Gideon's view, were entirely accurate, either because they all implied a kind of transaction in which both parties had something to say about the terms, and from where he stood, it appeared that only one party in this arrangement was doing any saying. The crowd was in good humor. That was what registered first, and registered wrong, because there is a kind of good humor that is indistinguishable from cruelty when you strip away the laughter and look at what is underneath. Men were calling out bids that were not serious. Bids numbers low enough to function as jokes, and following each number with commentary that drew laughter from the men on either side. A few women had come to watch as well, and stood toward the back with expressions that ranged from disapproval to the carefully arranged blankness of people who know that disapproval in this particular town at this particular moment is a luxury they cannot afford to display too openly. The auctioneer called for a serious bid. The crowd found this funnier than it was. Gideon was not thinking about any of this consciously. He was watching the figure on the platform. She was not moving much. Her hands hung at her sides. She was not wringing them. She was not pressing them together in the attitude of supplication that he might have expected. They were open at her sides, slightly cupped, and he watched them for a long moment before he understood what he was seeing. Her hands were the hands of a person who had decided not to make fists. Not because she was relaxed, and certainly not because she was resigned, but because she had made a deliberate choice not to give the crowd the visible evidence of her distress. Her hands were open because she had commanded them to be open. He could not have explained how he knew this. He simply knew it the way you know certain things when you have spent enough time alone with nothing but your own silences for company. Then she spoke. She was not speaking to the crowd. She was speaking too quietly for that. Her head was turned slightly to one side, and she was speaking toward the burlap fabric of the sack itself, the words pressed against the rough material and going no further, and what she said was so low he should not have been able to make it out from where he stood. But the crowd had shifted. There was a lull between one burst of laughter and the next, and in that lull, in the space between one cruelty and the one that followed, he heard her clearly. "Please stop looking at me like that." She was not saying it to any particular person. She was saying it to all of them, and none of them to the air to herself. She was saying it the way a person says a thing they know will not be heard but need to say anyway, just to know that somewhere in the universe the words exist. Gideon had said words like that. in a field, 8 years ago, and no one had heard him either. He stood at the back of the crowd for another minute. This was not hesitation. He was not a man who hesitated in the way that involves the body going still while the mind runs in circles. His stillness was a different kind. He was making certain of something, pressing his thumb against an intention, the way you press a thumb against a blade to test whether it is sharp enough for the work it is meant to do. He was remembering a field. He was remembering a choice he had made there, a choice shaped like silence, and he was measuring it against this moment the way an honest man measures an old mistake against a new opportunity to do something different. The auctioneer called for a bid again. The crowd offered another joke in place of one. Gideon moved through the crowd the way a river moves around a stone, not forcefully, not with any display, simply following the path of least resistance until he stood at the edge of the platform and then stepped up onto it without asking anyone's permission. Because there are moments when asking permission would be the wrong thing, and this was one of them. He reached into his coat and removed a pouch and set it on the small table at the edge of the platform beside the auctioneer's ledger. It was a leather pouch that he had brought down from the ridge for the salt and the lead and the rope, containing slightly more money than those things would cost because he sometimes left himself a margin for unexpected needs. He set it down without counting what was in it and without ceremony. The auctioneer looked at the pouch, looked up at Gideon. Gideon met his eyes and held them, and the auctioneer made a small sound and opened the pouch and counted and said the number aloud. It was twice what any man in the crowd had offered in earnest. The crowd went quiet. Not the quiet of respect, not exactly. The quiet of people who were not sure what they were watching and were waiting for more information before deciding how to respond to it. Gideon turned to face the figure on the platform. He was unhurried. He moved his hands slowly because she could not see him through the burlap, and slow hands make less alarming sounds than quick ones. He reached for the sack and lifted it carefully over her head and set it aside. And then he saw her. And then he understood something that he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for understanding. She was looking straight at him, not at the crowd, not at Warren Aldine, not at the auctioneer or the sky or the boards of the platform beneath her feet. At him, directly at him, with the focused quality of a woman who has decided that wherever her eyes go at this particular moment will say something about who she is, and she has decided to have them say the truest thing available. He had expected fear. He was a large man who had appeared suddenly and without warning in a situation already saturated with powerlessness, and fear would have been the rational response, the response he would not have judged or thought less of her for. He had expected the particular fear of the cornered eyes, wide and darting body angled for flight that it already knew was not possible. What he found instead was assessment. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something they are trying to classify, trying to locate in the taxonomy of things they already know, running him against every other man she had stood before in a moment of vulnerability, trying to determine which category he belonged to. Dangerous, harmless, useful, cruel. She was measuring him with her eyes, and she had not yet decided, and she was going to take whatever time she needed to decide, regardless of the crowd and the auctioneer and Warren Aldine and the sky that was by now pressing down like the lid of something closing. He gave her the time. He stood and let her look at him, and did not move to close the distance or to rush whatever was happening between them past the place it was at. She was 24 years old, which he would learn later, and she looked it in some ways, and older in others, the way people look when they have moved through things that add years without adding time. Her hair was dark and had come partially loose from its arrangement, which no one had helped her fix under the burlap, and several strands crossed her jaw. Her jaw was strong, her nose straight, her mouth set in the particular firm line of a person who is not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching it tremble. Her eyes were brown, a warm brown that was almost amber near the center, and they were direct in a way that made him think this was not something she had cultivated for effect, but simply something she had never lost, despite what appeared to be considerable effort on the world's part to take it from her. Along the right side of her neck and down onto the shoulder, disappearing beneath the neckline of her dress, there was a burn scar. It had healed unevenly as burns do, leaving the skin smooth in some places, and ridged in others permanently altered in color along its edges. It was not small. It was the kind of mark that defined the whole right side of what might otherwise have been considered a conventionally pretty face, and it did define it, and the definition it gave her was not the one the crowd had been laughing about. Gideon looked at the scar, the way he looked at everything without looking away, and without any visible change in his expression, and what he thought was a thought he had not expected. He thought that the scar had been made under tremendous heat, and that she had lived through whatever made it, and that whatever she had done or not done during the making of it had required a courage that most of the men currently standing in the crowd below him would not have been able to produce on their best day. He thought all of this in approximately 3 seconds. Then she spoke. Her voice was low and controlled, and she pitched it so that the crowd could hear it, which was a choice because she was close enough to him that she could have spoken only to him, and it would have been enough. "I will go with you," she said, "but not because you bought me. I have no money and no family that will stand for me in this town, and you appear to be the best option currently available. So I am choosing this. I want you to know that I am choosing it." The crowd reacted the way crowds react when something does not go according to the script they arrived with. There was a sound, a collective exhalation of surprise that was almost indistinguishable from the beginning of laughter, but did not finish, as laughter stopping somewhere in the middle and becoming something less certain. Gideon looked at her for a moment. He thought about the various things he could say in response to this, and considered each of them briefly, and found most of them inadequate. "All right," he said. She held his eyes for another second as though checking whether the agreement was real or merely polite. Then she nodded once, a small and precise movement. He turned and stepped off the platform and did not offer his hand because he had the sense that she would prefer to navigate the step herself, and he was right. She came down beside him with a slight catch of breath that might have been the cold and might have been something else, and then she was standing on the ground beside him and the crowd was rearranging itself around this new configuration of events. Warren Aldine had not said anything. He was standing where he had been standing, arms still folded, watching the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to read clearly from a distance, but that contained in it something that was not relief and was not disappointment and was not any simple emotion but something more layered, more uncomfortable. The expression of a man looking at something he has done that he already has complicated feelings about and will have more complicated feelings about later. Gideon went to collect his pouch and then stopped. There was a boy. He had not seen the boy before because the boy had been at the far edge of the crowd, too small to be visible through the mass of adults, and had only become visible now by virtue of moving. He was perhaps 10 years old with dark hair and the kind of face that had not yet decided what it would look like when it finished deciding all angles, and a wide forehead and eyes that were the same brown amber as the woman's. He was pushing through the crowd with the focused determination of a small person who has learned that the only way to get through a crowd of large people who are not paying attention to you is to make yourself feel like an inconvenience rather than an obstacle. He reached Nora, which was the name Gideon would learn later, and grabbed her hand with both of his, and for the first time her expression changed. It changed completely, the way a face changes when it stops performing composure and simply becomes itself. And what it became was the face of a woman who loves someone more than she is afraid of anything, which is a particular and recognizable thing. She crouched down to his level. Her voice dropped. She said something to him that was too low to carry, and he responded in kind, and then he pressed close to her, and she held on to him for just a moment, just one moment, her hand flat against the back of his head. Then she spoke into his ear. And Gideon, who was watching because he was a man who watched things without always appearing to watch them, saw her face change again. Something passed across it, something quick and serious, and then she arranged her expression back into the composed lines she had been maintaining and stood. She looked at Gideon. "Felix," she said, "my brother. He will stay in town with Dottie Marsh." Gideon looked at the boy. The boy looked at him with the frank and uncomplicated assessment that children perform when they are frightened but trying not to be. "He's welcome to come," Gideon said. "No." She said it without hesitation and without apology. Not yet. He understood this without needing it explained. She did not know him. She was not going to bring a 10-year-old boy into the mountains with a man she did not know. This was not timidity. This was the reasoning of a woman who was thinking clearly under considerable pressure, and he respected it the way he respected all clear thinking which was without commentary. The boy named Felix looked from Nora to Gideon and back to Nora and said something low and urgent. Nora said, "I will come back. I promise you." The boy pressed his mouth together in the way children do when they are trying to be brave about something they cannot argue with. Then he did something that Gideon had not anticipated. He turned to face Gideon, directly looked up at him with those amber-brown eyes, and said very plainly, with the particular earnestness of a child who has decided to say the truest thing available, "She came back for me once when everybody else ran. Don't let anything happen to her." Gideon looked at the boy for a long moment. "I won't," he said. He meant it. He said it the way he said the few things he said, without ornamentation, as a statement of fact, rather than a comfort or a promise of the performative kind. The boy seemed to understand the difference because he nodded once with the gravity of a person who has received an acceptable answer and then stepped back. Dottie Marsh appeared at the edge of the crowd. She was a large woman in her mid-50s with gray hair pulled back and an expression that conveyed without the need for words that she had seen enough in her years to not be particularly surprised by any of this, but was still prepared to have opinions about it. She put her hand on Felix's shoulder, and the boy leaned into this just slightly, and she looked at Nora with an expression that was complex and contained something that might have been guilt mixed with something that might have been relief. "I'll take care of him," she said. "Go on." Nora looked at Dottie for a moment with those steady eyes, and what passed between them was the kind of look that carries the weight of a history that has not been fully reckoned with, that has unpaid debts and complicated silences in it, and then Nora turned away. Gideon brought Soot around. He mounted and reached down, and Nora looked at his hand and at the horse and at him, and then she took his hand and let him pull her up behind him, and the crowd watched all of this without the laughter it had arrived with, because somewhere in the proceedings the entertainment had quietly become something else that no one had quite the vocabulary to name. He turned the horse toward the ridge road. He did not look back at the crowd. Neither did she. They had been riding for half an hour when the town disappeared behind the first serious curve of the trail, and the pines closed in on either side, and the sound of Harlan Creek became the sound of wind in the upper branches. The sky had lowered. The first tentative snowflakes were arriving, the advance scouts of something more committed that was building behind the peaks. Nora rode behind him without speaking. She had settled into the rhythm of the horse without apparent difficulty, which told him she had ridden before, and she held herself with a self-containment that he recognized because he had cultivated his own version of it for 8 years, and knew what the work of it felt like from the inside. He reached Copper Ridge's first serious switchback, the place where the trail narrowed, and the drop to the left became something that required attention, and he brought Soot to a slow stop. He unwrapped the heavy blanket that was rolled behind the saddle and turned in the seat. He said nothing. He held the blanket out. She looked at it. She looked at him. He could see her thinking through the geometry of this, locating it in the taxonomy of gestures she had presumably learned to be careful about. Then she took it and pulled it around her shoulders, and the movement was simple and practical and contained nothing in it that was either gratitude or refusal of the complexity of gratitude. He turned back to the trail, and they continued. After another 20 minutes, she said without any particular preamble, "My name is Nora." "Gideon," he said. A pause. The horse moved. Snow sifted down through the pines in small, determined increments. "Why did you do that?" she asked. He had anticipated this question and had been considering it during the ride, not because he did not know the answer, but because the answer was not simple, and he wanted to give her the accurate version rather than the version that would sound better. "Because I could," he said. "And because I know what it looks like when someone is trying not to let other people see how hard they're working to stay standing." She was quiet for a while after this. "That's a very specific thing to know," she said finally. Yes, he agreed. The trail curved upward. Soot leaned into the grade. Above them, through the thinning cloud, the outline of the ridge was beginning to be visible, the dark mass of the timber giving way to the paler stone of the upper slopes. The snow was thickening. His breath and hers made small, separate clouds that the wind took. Then she said something that he had not anticipated. "Felix told me something," she said, and her voice had changed, had lost the precision of the composed voice, and had become something more careful, more deliberate. "When he whispered to me at the platform, 'I want you to know what it was.'" "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I'm going to." He waited. "He told me," she said, "that the night before Warren put me up for auction, he heard Warren talking to someone in the other room. He said Warren told this person that he needed me gone because I knew something I wasn't supposed to know, and that with me gone, everything would be quiet again." Gideon held the reins steady. The horse continued. He kept his voice even. "Did you hear what it was, you know?" "I already know what I know," she said. "I've known it for 3 years. I just couldn't prove it to anyone who had the authority to do something about it." The cold was settling in properly now, the deep cold of altitude and evening coming on, and the pines on either side of the trail were dark and close and smelling of resin and snow. Somewhere above them the cabin sat with its cold hearth and its single window and its 8 years of solitude waiting to be interrupted by something that had not been planned for. He thought about what she had said. He thought about the auction and the crowd and Warren Aldine's expression and the boy's face. He thought about how some things have been building for a long time in plain sight of everyone before anything about them changes. He said, "When you're ready to tell me the rest of it, I'll listen." Behind him he felt the small adjustment of her sitting differently, a slight release of something she had been holding for longer than this conversation. "All right," she said. They rode the last hour to the cabin in a silence that was different from the silence they had started with. The first silence had been the silence of 2 strangers. This one was the silence of 2 people who had arrived by improbable routes at the same altitude and were looking in the same direction, and had not yet said everything there was to say, but had agreed without discussion that there would be time for saying it. The cabin came into view through the trees as the last pale light drained from the sky. Snow was collecting on the roof. The chimney was cold and dark. It was not much to look at. It was the place where he had learned to live without expecting anything from the world, and without the world expecting anything from him. He dismounted and reached up, and she came down beside him in the dark, and they stood for a moment in the yard with the snow coming down around them, and neither of them spoke because there was not yet a language for what this was. But it was something. That much was certain even then at the very beginning of it, even before anything had been explained or resolved or earned. It was something. And the mountain was indifferent to it in the way that mountains are indifferent to everything that happens within their company, which is to say completely, and also, somehow, not at all. Gideon opened the cabin door. He went in first and found the kindling and the matches and built the fire while she stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the careful eyes of someone assessing a new set of terms. The fire caught and grew and threw its yellow light across the plank walls and the single window and the table and the 2 chairs and the shelves of things arranged with the particular orderliness of a man who has lived alone long enough to know exactly where everything is in the dark. She stepped inside, closed the door against the cold. She was looking at the walls, at the rows of small marks cut into the wood above the window, rows of straight cuts grouped in 5s the way a man counts days when he wants to watch them accumulate. She did not ask about them. She went to the fire and held her hands out to it and stood there while the warmth reached her, and Gideon hung his coat and thought about what she had said on the trail about what she knew and what she could not prove, and what Warren Aldine needed to keep quiet, and he thought about a boy named Felix holding a woman's hand with both of his own at the edge of a crowd. He thought about the look on Warren Aldine's face at the auction. Not the look of a man selling something he did not value. The look of a man disposing of something that frightened him. He set the kettle on and found the second cup which he had never had cause to use before and set it on the table beside his own. And the fire burned and the snow came down outside, and the night settled in around Copper Ridge, the way it always settled in completely and without interest in the small human arrangements it enclosed. But something had changed. Something had arrived here that had not been here before, climbing up out of the valley with the cold and the snow and the end of a terrible day, something that was not yet named and was not yet understood, and had come with its own complications and its own buried truths, still waiting to be uncovered. And it had arrived in the form of a woman with a scar and steady eyes who had said in front of a crowd that was laughing that she was making a choice, and a man who had 8 years ago failed to say the same thing, and a 10-year-old boy who had pressed his mouth to his sister's ear on a platform in the center of Harlan Creek and whispered the one piece of information she had not yet had, something that was not a secret so much as a weight that had been waiting for the right moment to become a reckoning. The kettle began to steam. Gideon poured. Outside, the mountain held its cold and indifferent peace, and the snow covered everything equally the way it always does, making no distinction between the things that deserve to be covered and the things that do not, which is its one great limitation, and also, in certain lights, its one great mercy. He set his cup down and looked across the table at her. She was warming both hands around hers and looking into the fire with an expression that was not peaceful, but was tending in that direction the way water tends downhill, not fast, not without resistance, but trending toward something lower and quieter than what it had been. "There's a room," he said, "off the back. Not much, but it has a door." She looked at him. "I'll take the chair," he said. It was not an offer made with expectation. It was a statement of arrangement. She nodded. Then she said something that surprised him. "You counted 8 years," she said. "On the wall. 8 years of days." He said nothing. "That's a long time to keep counting," she said. He looked at the marks on the wall for a moment, the careful rows of scratched tally marks that he had made each morning with the same small knife he kept by the window, 1 mark per day accumulating in a column that had become something between a record and a habit and a form of accountability he had never fully explained to himself. "It is," he agreed. She did not ask what he was counting toward or away from. She finished her tea and stood and took her cup to the shelf and set it down and looked at the door to the back room. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went through the door and closed it, and Gideon sat alone by the fire, the way he had sat alone by fires for 8 years. But the room was different now. Not louder, not warmer, not yet. Just different in the way that a room is different when it knows that someone is in it who was not there before, when the proportions of solitude have shifted and the silence is divided by 2 instead of held by 1. He sat until the fire was low. Then he made his bed in the chair and listened to the snow, and thought about a boy who had pressed something into his sister's hand and a woman who had received it with a changed face and had not yet said what it was. And he thought that tomorrow or the day after or whenever she was ready, he would hear the rest of it. And that whatever it was the kind of thing that had been a long time building and a long time waiting for the right altitude to finally become visible. He closed his eyes. Above him the mountain kept its silence as it always had. But it was listening. The first week passed the way first weeks pass between people who do not yet have a language for each other. Carefully, with attention to the small borders of space and sound and habit that define a life lived alone and that do not dissolve simply because a second person has arrived to live inside them. Gideon woke before light as he always had. He built the fire as he always had. He went outside in the dark and checked the traps along the lower tree line as he always had, and when he returned, he set whatever he had found on the table by the door and went to fill the kettle from the barrel that collected snowmelt off the east corner of the roof. These things he had done in the same order for 8 years, and he continued to do them in the same order now because the order was not a performance for an audience and did not require modification simply because an audience had materialized. What changed was this: when he came back from the traps on the 3rd morning and pushed open the cabin door, the fire was already built and the kettle was already on, and Nora was standing at the small table near the window, cutting the dried venison he kept on the upper shelf into portions that were more precise than his own rough approximations. He stopped in the doorway. She did not look up. "You keep the knife on the wrong side," she said. "Left side of the shelf. If you keep it on the right, you reach for it with your right hand and knock the salt block every time." He looked at the shelf. The salt block had a worn edge on its left corner that he had been knocking for approximately 7 years and had accepted as a permanent feature of the shelf's character. He hung his coat. He sat down. He did not move the knife that morning. But 3 days later, when Nora was outside splitting the kindling, she had insisted on splitting herself, despite the blisters that had formed on the second day, and that she treated each night with a quiet efficiency that did not invite comment. He moved the knife to the right side of the shelf where it belonged. She noticed the next morning and said nothing, and that was in its way its own kind of conversation. She was a fast learner. This was not the mild observational compliment that people offer when they mean to be encouraging. It was simply accurate. She watched a thing once and then did it not perfectly at first, but with the kind of purposeful imperfection that is the precursor to mastery rather than the evidence of limitation. He showed her the traps on the 4th day, the placement and the mechanics, and which ground was worth checking and which was not, and on the 5th day she checked the eastern line herself while he worked on the roof where a section of the pine shake had loosened in the first serious snow. She came back with 2 rabbits and a look on her face that was not quite pride, but was the cousin of it, the particular satisfaction of a person who has done something genuinely difficult and knows it and does not need anyone to confirm it for them. He looked at the rabbits, then at her. "Eastern line's further than it looks," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She handed him the rabbits and went inside to wash her hands, and that was the end of that exchange, which was complete. The blisters on her palms healed faster than he expected. On the 6th morning he set a pair of his old work gloves on the table beside her cup, without comment the smaller pair he had kept from before his hands had fully grown into themselves, soft leather, worn smooth across the palm. She put them on, and they were still slightly large, and she turned her hands over looking at them, and then she picked up the axe and went out to the woodpile, and that was that. It was on the 7th evening that he found her with the book. He had one shelf of books, 12 volumes acquired over 8 years by routes various, and occasionally improbable, a shelf that represented the better part of his reading life on the ridge, and that he had never thought of as anything other than his own. He came in from banking the fire in the outdoor pit to find Nora sitting at the table with her knees drawn up and a candle lit and one of his books open in her lap. It was the Bible, the old one with the broken spine that sat at the left end of the shelf. He had not opened it in 2 years. She had it open to the front page, the inside cover, and she was reading it with her face held very still in the way her face went still when she was receiving information she needed to process before she responded to it. He sat down in his chair across the room and picked up the length of trap wire he had been meaning to splice and worked at it, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say yet, and he had learned over 8 years of considerable solitude that the best thing you can do with a silence that is still forming is let it finish forming before you say a word into it. After a while she looked up. "Margaret," she said. It was not a question. It was the careful pronunciation of a name she had just encountered and was handling with the delicacy it deserved. "Yes," he said. She looked back down at the page. He could not see what was written there from where he sat, but he knew what was there. He had written it himself 11 years ago in the handwriting of a younger man with a different future in front of him. "To Colt, with all my love." And then the name. And then nothing else, because Margaret had not been a woman who believed in saying more than the essential thing, which was a quality he had loved in her and had tried with imperfect results to cultivate in himself. Her name for him had been Colt, a name she had given him because she said his given name sounded like a man who had already arrived somewhere, and she preferred to think of him as a man still in motion toward something. He had kept Gideon after she left because he did not feel much like anything in motion, but the book still said what it said. "She loved you," Nora said. It was not a question either. "Yes," he said. Nora turned another page slowly, not reading but giving the moment its proper duration. Then she set the book carefully on the table beside the candle spine, up the way you set down something that belongs to someone else, and that you have been trusted with briefly." She did not ask what had happened to Margaret. She did not ask where she was or how she was gone, or what role Gideon had played in the events that ended with him alone on a mountain, counting days on a cabin wall. She did not ask because she was a woman who understood from considerable personal experience that there are things a person will tell you when they are ready, and that asking before they are ready produces only the shape of the answer and never the real one. She blew out the candle and went to her room and closed the door. Gideon sat in the dark with the dying fire and the spliced wire in his hands, and thought about Margaret. He did this sometimes, though less than he used to, and always with the same internal discipline, the same careful limitation of how far he allowed the thought to go before he brought it back. Tonight he let it go a little further than usual. He let himself think about her face and her voice, and the way she had written in that Bible with the ink slightly too thick, pressing too hard, the way she did everything with more force than was strictly necessary, because she believed that the world responded better to definite things than to tentative ones. She had been right about that, and about most things, and he had let someone take everything she had because he had stood in a field and been silent when silence was the one thing he should not have offered. He sat with this for a long time. Then he put the wire down and went to sleep in the chair. And in the morning the world outside was blinding white with new snow, and Nora was already at the fire, and the book was back on the shelf where it belonged, and neither of them said anything about it. That was the 7th day. On the 9th day, Dottie Marsh came up the mountain. Gideon heard the horse before he saw it, a single horse moving at the careful pace of an animal not accustomed to altitude, and he was outside with the axe in his hand when Dottie came around the last bend in the trail, red-faced from the cold, and sitting her horse with the determined erectness of a woman who has decided that she is going to do a thing and is doing it regardless of what her body thinks about the decision. Behind her, on a smaller horse that looked equally uncertain about the elevation, was Felix. The boy was wearing a coat 2 sizes too big, borrowed from somewhere, and his face was the particular determined blankness of a child who has prepared arguments in advance for every objection he anticipates being raised. He looked at Gideon from the saddle with those amber-brown eyes and said before Gideon could speak at all, "I am not staying in town anymore." Gideon looked at Dottie. Dottie looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has fought this battle and lost it and has arrived to deliver the terms of her defeat. "He stopped eating," she said. "3 days ago. He would take a bite and then stop and look at the door and put the fork down. I tried everything I know how to try." She paused. "I know how to try quite a lot of things. None of them worked." Gideon looked back at Felix. The boy had not moved. He was still sitting the horse with his prepared arguments assembled and ready, and something about his face, the particular set of it, the way it combined stubbornness with a fear it was trying very hard not to show, did something to Gideon's chest that he was not entirely prepared for. "Go on inside," he said. "Your sister's splitting wood out back. She'll hear you go around." Felix's face changed then. The prepared arguments dissolved, and what was underneath them was simply a 10-year-old boy who had been separated from the only person he fully trusted, and who had managed by some combination of will and stubbornness and a refusal to eat that Gideon suspected had frightened Dottie more than she was letting on to close that distance. The boy slid off the horse and went around the side of the cabin at something just slower than a run, and a moment later Gideon heard Nora's voice, and then a sound he had not yet heard from her in 9 days, a real sound, unrehearsed and unguarded, the kind that comes out of a person before they have time to decide whether to let it out. He went to help Dottie dismount. She accepted the assistance without comment, which from Dottie was a significant concession. When she was down, she stood for a moment looking at the cabin and the ridge above it and the sky, and then she looked at Gideon with the considering expression she wore when she was deciding how honest to be. "She doing all right up here?" Dottie asked. "Yes," he said. "She talked to you some?" Dottie nodded slowly. She was looking at the cabin, still at the smoke from the chimney and the wood pile and the carefully banked snow around the door that kept the draft out, and she was thinking about something that she had not yet decided whether to say. "I have known Nora since she was 7 years old," Dottie said finally. Her mother was my closest friend, Eleanor Aldine. She was Eleanor Pryor before she married Warren, and she was the finest woman in this county and possibly in this territory, and I say that with full knowledge of my own qualities." She paused. "Warren was not always what he is now, or maybe he was always what he is and just showed it different when Eleanor was alive to see it. I cannot say with certainty." Gideon waited. "What I can say with certainty," Dottie continued, "is that the night of that fire 3 years ago I was awake because my dog was sick and I was up with him by the window. And I saw Warren Aldine come out of that house before anyone else came out of that house, before his wife, before those 2 children." She stopped, her mouth pressed together briefly. "I told myself I was not sure of what I saw. I told myself it was dark and I was tired and the fire was confusing everything. I have been telling myself those things for 3 years. She looked at Gideon directly now. "I was sure," she said. "I was completely sure. I was just afraid of the man and I did not want the trouble. And Eleanor is dead and Nora has a scar she will carry her whole life, and that boy spent 2 weeks in my guest room not eating because his sister was gone, and I told myself I was not sure." She drew a breath. "I am coming to the end of my patience with the story I have been telling myself." Gideon looked at this woman, this 60-year-old widow with her red face and her borrowed horse and her 3-year-old silence that had finally become heavier than her fear, and he felt a deep and uncomplicated respect for the difficulty of what she had just said. "You would say that to a judge?" he asked. "I would say it to God himself," Dottie said with the finality of a woman who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. Gideon nodded. "Come inside," he said. "There is coffee." He did not say anything about what she had told him not that afternoon while she sat at his table and drank his coffee and talked with Nora in the low voices of women who are relearning a trust that has been interrupted. He did not say anything while Felix talked at approximately the same rate that a stream runs in spring thaw, filling every available space with observations and questions and the occasional statement of fact delivered with the authority of someone who has thought carefully about his subject. He did not say anything because it was not yet time. The pieces were assembling themselves one by one in a sequence that had its own logic, and he had learned long ago that the worst thing you can do with a thing that is assembling is rush it past the point of its own readiness. But that evening when Dottie had started down the mountain and Felix was asleep in the chair by the fire with his coat still on and his mouth open, Gideon sat across from Nora in the long November dark, and the fire burned low between them, and he said, "Dottie saw Warren come out of the house first." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "She will say it in front of a judge." Nora looked up from the fire. Her face in the firelight was a study in the kind of careful hope that has been taught by experience to present itself cautiously, to not come in through the door at full speed because it has been shut out before. "There is more than that," she said. And then she told him about the paper. She told it the way she told everything without decoration, in the order that it happened, with the particular clarity of someone who has organized a set of facts in their mind many times over a long period and knows exactly where each piece sits and how it connects to the pieces beside it. 3 years ago, she said. 2 weeks after the fire. She had been staying at Dottie's with Felix, both of them in the guest room with the narrow window that looked out toward the burned lot where the house had been, which she had asked Dottie to please put a curtain over, and Dottie had done it that same afternoon without asking why. Warren had come to collect what he said was owed to him from the insurance claim. He had gone back to the lot to sift through the remains, which was a thing people did after fires to find whatever the heat had left behind. She had watched him from behind the curtained window and thought about the way he had looked coming down the main street of Harlan Creek the morning after the fire, the way his face had arranged itself into grief and had not quite gotten the arrangement right, the way grief sits differently on a man who has earned it versus a man who is performing it. She had not been able to name what she was thinking then. She was 21 years old, and her mother was dead, and her neck hurt in a way the doctor said would diminish with time, and mostly had, and she was not ready to name the thing taking shape in the back of her mind, because naming it meant beginning to believe it, and believing it meant the world was a considerably darker place than the one she had been trying to live in. Felix had named it for her. He was 7 at the time, which is old enough to see things clearly, and young enough that adults do not always adjust their behavior in his presence the way they would adjust it for someone they consider to be watching. On the day Warren came to sift through the lot, Felix had gone out through the back of Dottie's property and made his way around the block by a route known only to children and to dogs, and he had crouched behind what remained of the back fence and watched Warren Aldine go through the ashes with a long stick. And Felix had seen Warren find something, look at it, and put it in his coat pocket instead of the sack he was filling with salvageable items. Felix had waited until Warren left. Then he had gone into the lot himself to the place where Warren had been standing, and he had found what Warren had not managed to find, a second piece that had shifted in the ash while Warren was occupied settling 2 feet from where it started before the wind decided to leave it alone. A piece of paper, half burned, one corner missing entirely and the edges brown and fragile, but the center, the part that held the words, had survived intact in the way that some things survive when the fire has not yet reached full temperature where they lie and the wind carries them sideways before the heat fully arrives. It was an insurance document, dated 2 weeks before the fire, made out in Warren Aldine's name, covering the property and its contents for a sum considerably larger than any honest assessment of the house's worth would have produced, signed and witnessed and filed with a firm in Billings. Warren had insured his house for a sum that made sense only if he already knew the house was not going to be standing for very much longer. Felix had brought the paper to his sister and set it on the bed between them, and Nora had looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she had folded it carefully along the one intact fold line and placed it inside the cover of the small book of hymns that had been in her coat pocket on the night of the fire. The coat she had grabbed because it was hanging by the front door, and the front door was where she had tried to go first before the fire in the hallway turned her back, and she had gone out through Felix's window instead, through the window with the boy under her arm and the heat at her back. She had kept it there for 3 years. The hymn book with the paper inside. Through the months at Dottie's and through the 1.5 years at the boarding house where she had worked for her room, and through the 6 months at Warren's ranch where she had gone because she had run out of money and options, and Warren had offered her a position as housekeeper with the manner of a man conferring a kindness, and she had taken it because she had Felix to feed and a territory that did not offer many alternatives to a woman with a scar and no family to speak for her. She had kept the tin under the loose board beneath her cot in the room off the kitchen, and she had carried it to the auction platform in the pocket of her dress because she had not wanted to leave it behind in a house she was leaving for good, and she did not know yet what she was going to do with it, only that she was not going to leave it. When she finished, the fire between them had burned down to coals that gave a low red light, and Gideon had not moved in a long time, sitting the way he sat when he was thinking completely still in the manner of a large thing that does not need to move to be fully present. "Do you still have it?" he asked. She reached into the pocket of her dress and set a small tobacco tin on the table between them. Dented. A particular pressure at a particular point opened the lid, which she demonstrated, lifting it to reveal the hymn book inside. From between the last page and the back cover carefully she lifted the paper. Half a paper, burned at the edges, the center intact. Gideon leaned forward and looked at it in the low red light without touching it. He could read it from where he sat. The date was clear. The name was clear. The sum and the property description and the signature of the agent in Billings and the witness signature and the notary mark, all of it preserved in the careful legal hand of the person who had filled it out 2 weeks before Eleanor Aldine died in a fire that her husband had walked out of first. He sat back. "Felix found this," he said. "Felix found this," she confirmed, "and Felix is 10 years old. He was 7 when he found it. He is 10 now. He has an excellent memory and a clear account of what he saw. I have asked him about it many times across 3 years, and his account does not change." She refolded the paper along its fold and placed it back in the hymn book, and the hymn book back in the tin, and pressed the lid shut. "It never changes." Gideon was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the pine canopy in long, low sweeps that made the cabin creak at its joints the way old wood creaks in cold complaining but holding. Felix was still asleep in the chair, his breathing audible, and even his face in sleep entirely peaceful in the way children's faces go peaceful when they are sufficiently tired without the overlay of management and caution that waking faces carry. "He will have to say it," Gideon said. "In front of a judge, what he saw that day, where he found the paper." Nora looked at Felix sleeping. "I know," she said. "He is 10 years old." "I know how old he is," she said. "Not sharp, just certain. He will do it. You do not know him yet. He will do it." Gideon looked at the boy, too. At the face that had looked up at him from the auction platform with those amber-brown eyes and said with all the directness of a person who has decided that the truest thing is always the right thing to say, "She came back for me once when everybody else ran. Don't let anything happen to her." "I believe you," Gideon said. She looked at him steadily. "Why did you come down from the mountain?" she asked. Not the same question she had asked on the trail. Not the surface question, but the one beneath it, the one that had been sitting in the room for 9 days, waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. "Not today. 8 years ago. Why did you stop being in the world?" He had not been asked this question in 8 years because no one had been close enough to him to ask it. He found somewhat to his own surprise that he did not want to deflect it. He thought about deflecting it, and then thought about Margaret's handwriting in the Bible and Dottie's face when she said "I was completely sure," and the paper in the tobacco tin on the table, and he thought that there had been enough deflection in this story already. More than enough. The kind of excess that leaves people dead and children without mothers and women on auction platforms in the middle of November. "There was a woman," he said. "Her name was Margaret. I met her when I was 26. And I knew inside 3 weeks that she was the person I was going to spend my life next to, and I was right about that. And being right about it was the best thing I had." He stopped and looked at the Coles. Her family, the Vosses, had land south of the ridge, good land river bottom, the kind that gets men's attention when they think no one capable of defending it is watching. A man in town decided he wanted it. He had the means to push the family out and the connections to make it look legal, and the kind of confidence that comes with never having been told no by anything that mattered. He stopped again. "You did not stop him," Nora said. "It was not an accusation. It was the quiet statement of a woman who has already understood the shape of the story from the shape of the man telling it." "I knew what he was doing," Gideon said. "I knew early enough that knowing would have been useful. I was working a logging contract 50 miles north, and I kept telling myself I would come back and deal with it when the contract was done. I kept finding reasons why now was not quite the moment. The truth was, I was afraid of the man in the particular way that men are afraid of other men who have money and connections, and the law arranged conveniently on their side." He turned the cup in his hands. "By the time I came back, Margaret's family had lost the land and the house and moved away, and Margaret had followed them, and I went after her and found her in Billings, and what she said to me was not cruel. It was just true. She said she had needed me at a specific moment, and I had not been there, and she could not build a life next to a man who chose his fear over her when the choosing mattered." The fire had gone entirely to coals now. The room was lit in deep red that made everything look like the interior of something old and warm. "She was right," he said. "Yes," Nora said. She did not say it to wound him. She said it because she was a woman who had learned that confirming a true thing is a form of respect, not a cruelty. "And the man who took her family's land, what happened to him?" "He is still in Harlan Creek," Gideon said. "His name is Cole Pratt." Nora went very still. "Cole Pratt is the deputy," she said. "He was not the deputy then. He was a private citizen with money and connections. He became the deputy 4 years ago, which is one of several reasons I have remained on the ridge and conducted my business in ways that do not require me to pass through his office." He set the cup down. "And which is why what Dottie said this afternoon matters, and why your paper matters, and why what Felix saw matters. Because the man who would need to be convinced to open a case against Warren Aldine is the same man who has spent 4 years arranging the law to his own convenience, and he will need to be faced with something he cannot dismiss." Nora looked at the tobacco tin. "A half-burned insurance document," she said, "and the testimony of a 10-year-old boy and a woman with a scar and a widow who was afraid for 3 years. And a circuit judge who comes through in December," Gideon said, "who is not Cole Pratt's judge and does not owe Cole Pratt anything." The room was quiet for a moment. Felix breathed. The wind moved. "Is that enough?" she asked. He considered this honestly the way he considered everything. "If we move before Warren understands that the paper exists and that Felix can speak to what he saw, then yes," he said. "It may be enough. But we will need to move before he understands what is coming. A frightened man with something to lose does unpredictable things when he feels the ground shifting under him." She looked at the tin in her hands. She turned it over once and then set it back on the table between them. Then she said something that surprised him. "You have been up here 8 years," she said, "because you were afraid that what you did was unforgivable. And you have been punishing yourself for it by being alone, which is a punishment that hurts only you and helps no one, least of all Margaret." He said nothing. There was nothing to say to an accurate statement delivered without malice. "I am not saying this to wound you," she continued, her voice even and low. "I am saying it because I have spent 3 years carrying a piece of paper that could have freed me and Felix, and could not bring myself to use it because every time I thought about going to the law, I thought about who the law was and what they would see when they looked at me, and I found a reason to wait, and another reason to wait, and the waiting became its own kind of punishment that hurt only me and helped no one." She picked up the tin again. "I am done waiting, and I think you are too." Gideon looked at her in the dying red light of the coals, this woman with the burn scar along her neck and the steady eyes and the tobacco tin with 3 years of evidence inside it, and he thought that he had come down from the mountain that morning to observe the anniversary of a failure, and had somehow arrived by routes he could not have predicted at something that looked very much like the thing failures are eventually supposed to teach you. He thought about the 17th of November, and about Margaret, and about a field. And then, slowly, he thought past those things. "We will go down in 3 days," he said. "Dottie will know when the judge arrives. We prepare Felix for what a courtroom requires of a witness, and we say nothing to anyone in Harlan Creek before we are ready to say everything." Nora nodded. "And Cole Pratt?" she asked. "Cole Pratt," Gideon said, "has been avoiding a reckoning for 8 years. He can wait 3 more days." Something moved in Nora's face, then something small and careful, and trying not to be more than it was ready to be the early form of something that would need time and more evidence than 3 days could supply before it became the thing it was headed toward. She stood. She looked at Felix sleeping, and everything she felt for this boy was in that look. The whole weight of 3 years of protecting him, and the fire that had started those years, and the mother who had not come out of it, and the man who had come out first, all of it compressed into the face of a woman looking at a sleeping child and knowing that the next thing she did would determine what kind of story this became. She went to him and carefully removed the oversized coat and laid it across him like a blanket, and then she straightened up. She looked at Gideon one more time. 8 years is a long time to keep counting," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Maybe," she said quietly, "it is long enough." She went to her room and closed the door, and the cabin was quiet, and the fire was coals, and outside the wind moved through the upper pines in long, sweeping sounds like water, and Gideon sat in the dark for a while longer. He looked at the marks on the wall, 8 years of days scratched one by one in the same place at the same time each morning, a column of accumulated silence. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at the tobacco tin on the table, the cold cup beside it, the boy sleeping in the chair with the coat across him like a blanket. He looked at the door to the back room closed and quiet. Outside the snow had stopped and the sky had cleared, and through the single window the stars were visible above the ridge, more stars than can be seen from any valley. The full inventory of the sky visible only at altitude, only to people who have come high enough to get above the haze that obscures them from below. He did not pick up the wire he had been splicing. He did not read. He sat and let the quiet of the cabin be the quiet it was now which was different from the quiet it had been 10 days ago in ways that were not yet nameable, but that were real, present in the room, the way warmth is present after a fire has been burning long enough to reach the walls. In the morning he would go down and find out when the circuit judge was coming. In the morning he would begin preparing for what came next, which was not nothing and was not small, and would require from him exactly the thing he had failed to produce 8 years ago in a field outside Billings, when it would have mattered to a different woman in a different set of circumstances. He sat until the coals went dark. Then he pulled his coat up and closed his eyes and let the mountain hold its silence around the cabin the way it always had, without preference or judgment, the same indifference it offered to everything that happened within its reach. But something had changed on Copper Ridge. Something that had not been there on the 16th of November was here now on the 26th present, in the way that only things which have been a long time arriving are truly present when they finally come. Not loud, not certain of itself yet, but there, the way a fire is there, when it has finally caught, when the kindling has done its work, and the wood beneath has taken the heat, and the thing sustaining itself is no longer a question of whether, but a question of how far, and how bright, and how long. Gideon Warr sat in his chair on Copper Ridge and breathed and waited for morning. The mountain held its peace. Below in the valley, Harlan Creek slept, not knowing yet what was coming down toward it in 3 days' time, carrying a tobacco tin and 3 years of evidence and the testimony of a 10-year-old boy who had an excellent memory and had never once, across 3 years of careful questioning, changed his account. Not once. The morning they came down from the mountain, the sky was clear and hard and blue, in the way that December skies in Montana are blue without softness, without any of the apology that spring and summer build into their colors. It was the kind of clarity that makes distances deceptive, that makes the valley below look closer than it is, and the ridge behind look further, and that carries sound in ways that the heavy air of lower elevations does not. Gideon had gone down alone the day before to find Dottie. He had left before first light, before Nora and Felix were awake, and he had ridden Soot down the trail at a pace the horse found agreeable, and he found useful for thinking, which was to say a steady walk with enough of the animal's warmth beneath him to keep the cold at a manageable distance. He had gone to Dottie's back door and knocked twice in the particular pattern that Dottie had established years ago as the signal for people who needed to come in without being seen coming in, which was a pattern she had invented during a period when 3 different men in Harlan Creek owed her money, and she had found it convenient to distinguish between visitors she wanted to acknowledge and visitors she preferred to process at her own pace. Dottie had opened the door in her house coat with a lamp in her hand and looked at him, and then looked past him at the empty yard and said, "Come in, then." And he had. The circuit judge, whose name was Aldous Fenn, and whose reputation Dottie summarized as thorough and not for sale, was arriving in Harlan Creek on the 4th of December to hold 3 days of proceedings on various matters that had accumulated since his last pass through the territory. This was 6 days away. Dottie had already sent word to Judge Fenn's clerk by way of the mail rider who made the Billings run every 10 days that there was a matter requiring his attention that had not previously been on his docket. She had done this 2 days ago without being asked, because she was Dottie Marsh, and when she made a decision, she did not hold it in her hands, waiting for someone to tell her what to do with it. "Cole Pratt does not know you are coming down," she said. It was not a question. "No," Gideon said. "He will know the morning you arrive. There is no way around that in a town this size." She poured coffee she had not offered and set it in front of him, which from Dottie was the same as an offer with considerably less ceremony attached. "He will try to speak to the judge before you can. He will call in whatever he is owed by whatever men he has arranged things with. He will move fast." "I know," Gideon said. "We will move faster." Dottie looked at him across the kitchen table with the considering expression that she wore when she was measuring a person against what they had just said, checking the fit between the claim and the man making it. "You have changed somewhat," she said finally, "since the last time I saw you in any situation that required something from you." He drank his coffee. "Something happened," he said. "Yes," she said. "I can see that." He had ridden back up the mountain in the early afternoon and told Nora and Felix what he had found. And that evening, while Felix slept, Nora and Gideon had sat at the table and spoken about what the morning after tomorrow would require of each of them, and the conversation had been practical and precise and had covered every contingency they could anticipate. And when it was finished, Nora had said simply, "All right then," and gone to bed. And Gideon had sat for a while in the quiet of the cabin, thinking about the particular courage of a person who is afraid and goes forward anyway, which is the only real kind. Now it was 2 mornings later, and they were on the trail, the 3 of them, Gideon on Soot, and Nora on the smaller horse that had come up with Dottie, and that Dottie had left for this purpose because she had thought ahead in ways that did not require discussion. Felix rode behind Nora, his arms around her waist, his chin on her shoulder, looking at the valley below, with the expression of a boy preparing himself for something he has thought about carefully and made his peace with. They did not speak much on the way down. There was not much left to say that had not already been said, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, now the kind that does not need to be filled, because the people inside it have come to sufficient terms with each other that the absence of words is no longer a space waiting to be occupied, but simply a place where words are not currently needed. Halfway down, Nora said, "Felix." "I know," Felix said from behind her shoulder. "Tell me." He had been prepared for this, for what a courtroom required, not coached in the sense of being told what to say, but prepared in the sense of understanding the setting, what a judge was, what a witness was, what the difference was between saying what you saw and saying what you think about what you saw. Gideon had done this with him the previous afternoon in the cabin while Nora was outside sitting across from the boy at the table and speaking to him the way he would have wanted someone to speak to him at 10 years old, directly and without condescension, as one person explaining a serious situation to another person who was capable of understanding it. Felix had listened with the total attention that children bring to things they understand to be important. He had asked 2 questions, both of them good ones, and then he had said, "I will not change what I say because I remember exactly what I saw, and I saw it clearly, and it is true." And Gideon had looked at this boy and thought that whatever else came out of the next several days, Felix Aldine was going to be all right in this world. "I went out through the back," Felix said now from behind his sister's shoulder, reciting not with the flatness of memorization, but with the even cadence of a person who has told a true thing so many times it has become simply part of what they know. "I went around by this back fence. I watched Warren go through the ashes. I saw him find something and put it in his coat instead of the sack. After he left, I went in and found the paper near where he was standing. I brought it to Nora. I have had it since then. That is what I saw, and that is what happened." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Felix put his chin back on her shoulder and looked at the valley. They reached the floor of the valley by mid-morning and came into Harlan Creek from the north end, which was the end that contained the church and the schoolhouse and the 2 houses belonging to families who had arrived early enough to claim the flattest ground. The south end was where the commerce was, where Dottie's store was, where the deputy's office was, where the platform in the square stood empty now with a skin of ice across its boards from the previous night's freeze. Gideon rode in the way he always rode in, with no particular announcement, but the town noticed him the way it always noticed him, and this time there was additional information for it to process, because he was not alone, and one of the people with him was the woman who had been on the platform 3 weeks ago, and who the town had watched ride away with him in the manner of people watching a thing that they expect to have more to say about later. The later had arrived. The first person to see them was a boy of about 12 who was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store and who stopped sweeping when he saw them and watched them pass with his mouth slightly open. The second person was a woman named Agnes Holt, who was coming out of the bakery with a wrapped parcel, and who stopped on the steps and held the parcel against her chest and looked at Nora with an expression that began as the same cruelty that had attended the auction and shifted slowly as she looked into something more complicated and less certain of itself. Nora looked straight ahead. She was sitting that horse the way she had done everything on the mountain, with the practical directness of a person who has somewhere to be and intends to be there. The burn scar was visible in the cold air, the skin along her neck and shoulder carrying the pale and ridged landscape of what had been done to it 3 years ago, and she did not cover it, and she did not angle her face away from it. And if anyone in Harlan Creek had been paying sufficiently careful attention, they would have noticed that this was different from how she had moved through this town before, when she had kept her right side turned toward the wall and her collar up, and had learned to navigate public spaces in a way that minimized the number of people who had a clear line of sight to the scar. She was not navigating that way today. They went directly to Dottie's. Dottie was waiting in the doorway with her coat on and her hair up, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a thing and is relieved to see it arriving on schedule. She took Felix inside first and then came back out and stood on the step beside Gideon while Nora dismounted. "Pratt has been in his office all morning," Dottie said low and even. "He saw the message I sent to the judge's clerk. I do not know how, but he knows something is coming. He has not come to ask me about it directly, which means he is calculating, which means he does not yet know what he is calculating against." What Pratt had done instead, Dottie said, was go to Warren. She knew this because she had seen Pratt's horse tied outside Warren's place the previous evening for nearly an hour. She did not know what was said, but when Pratt left, Warren had been standing in his doorway watching the deputy ride away, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has just been told his problem is larger than he believed it was. "The judge arrives tomorrow," Gideon said. "Tomorrow afternoon. His clerk sent word this morning. He has agreed to hear the new matter first, before the rest of the docket." Dottie looked at Nora. "Are you ready?" Nora considered this question with the seriousness it deserved rather than answering it reflexively. "Yes," she said. "Then come inside," Dottie said. "There is a great deal to do before tomorrow afternoon, and standing in the cold accomplishes none of it." They went inside and the door closed, and Harlan Creek continued its morning around this fact, the way towns continue around facts they have not yet decided what to do with. In his office at the south end of the main road, Cole Pratt sat behind his desk and thought about what he knew and what he did not know, and the difference between those two categories was narrowing in a direction he did not find comfortable. Judge Aldous Fenn arrived the following afternoon in a black coat that had seen considerable weather, and a manner that was brisk without being unkind, which is the manner of a man who has too much to do and has made peace with that fact. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with eyes that moved quickly and settled slowly, and that gave the impression of a mind that gathered information rapidly and released conclusions only when it was satisfied with them. He heard the matter in the back room of Dottie's store, which was the largest interior space in Harlan Creek that was not the church, and which Dottie had prepared for the purpose by removing the flour sacks and the pie counter and setting up chairs and a table with the gravity of a woman who understands that the setting of a proceeding is part of the proceeding. Cole Pratt had attempted to speak to the judge the previous evening at the boarding house where Judge Fenn took his meals when he was in Harlan Creek. Dottie knew this because the woman who ran the boarding house was her cousin, and her cousin had told her. Judge Fenn had told Cole Pratt that he conducted no private discussions with interested parties before a scheduled hearing, and that if Pratt wished to be present at the hearing, he was welcome to attend in his official capacity as deputy, and that if he had relevant information to contribute, he could offer it at the appropriate moment in the proceedings. And that was the end of the conversation. Cole Pratt was sitting in the back row when Gideon brought Nora and Felix in. Gideon had expected this and had prepared himself for it, which meant he had spent a portion of the previous evening reminding himself that what happened in this room today was not about Cole Pratt. It was about Warren Aldine and a piece of paper and a 10-year-old boy and a woman who had been carrying both of them for 3 years. Cole Pratt was a separate matter and a separate reckoning, and there was a time for that reckoning, but it was not during the minutes when Felix was going to stand up and say what he had seen. Warren Aldine was in the front row. He had come because he had been formally notified, which was a thing Judge Fenn's clerk did as a matter of procedure, and because not coming would itself have been a statement he was not yet prepared to make. He was sitting with his arms folded in the posture that Gideon had observed at the auction, the posture of a man waiting for something unpleasant to conclude, but today there was something beneath the posture that had not been visible at the auction. Today there was a quality of attention in Warren Aldine's stillness that was different from patience. It was the stillness of a man who is listening to every sound in the room for information about which direction the threat is coming from. He had not looked at Nora when she came in. He had looked at the floor and kept looking at it, which was itself a form of information. Judge Fenn called the matter to order with the efficiency of a man who has conducted proceedings in back rooms and courthouse halls and open fields and has long since ceased to require particular surroundings to achieve the necessary seriousness. He asked Nora to begin. She stood. She had put on the dress that Dottie had provided, a plain dark wool dress that was neither fine nor shabby, that said nothing about her circumstances, but allowed her to say everything about herself without the competition of ornamentation. She had put her hair up simply. The burn scar was visible, and she had made no arrangement to conceal it. She told the story in the same order she had told it on the mountain, without decoration, without the particular inflation of detail that people sometimes employ when they are trying to persuade rather than simply to recount. She told it as a sequence of things that had happened in the order they had happened, and her voice did not rise and did not shake. And when she reached the part about the night of the fire, she slowed slightly, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she wanted the sequence of events to be perfectly clear, and she was taking the time required to make them so. She said that she had tried to go out the front door. She said the fire was already in the hallway when she got there. She said she turned back and went to Felix's room, which was the second door on the left, and which had a window that opened onto the side yard, and she went out through the window with Felix and landed in the side yard, and the fall was not far, and Felix was not hurt, but she hit the ground wrong on her right side, and the fire from the hallway window was already close enough to reach her before she could get clear of the house. She said she had looked for her mother and could not find her. She said Warren had been standing in the yard when she came around the front of the house, already there, already standing in the yard watching the house burn from a distance sufficient to confirm that he had not recently come out of it. Judge Fenn asked her 2 questions, both of them clarifying rather than challenging, and she answered them with the same even precision. Then he asked for the document. She set the tobacco tin on the table and opened it the way she always opened it, with the particular pressure at the particular point, and she removed the hymn book, and from inside it the paper, and she set it in front of him, and he put on his spectacles and read it. The room was very quiet while he read. Warren Aldine was looking at the floor. Cole Pratt in the back row was looking at the paper in the judge's hands with an expression that was working hard to remain neutral and was not entirely succeeding. Judge Fenn read the document twice. He set it down on the table and looked at the date and looked at the property description and looked at the sum. He looked up. "This document was in the structure at the time of the fire," he said. "My brother found it in the remains of the lot 2 weeks after the fire," Nora said, "in the area near the east wall, which was the last section to fully collapse." "Your brother," the judge said, "who is currently 10 years old. He was 7 at the time he found it. He is 10 now." Judge Fenn looked at Felix, who was sitting in the chair beside Dottie with his hands on his knees and his back straight and his face arranged into the expression that Gideon had seen him prepare the previous afternoon, the face of a person who is ready. "Come up, son," the judge said. Felix came up. He was small for 10, which made the chair they put him in seem larger than it was, but he sat in it with the same quality of settled readiness that his sister carried, the family resemblance expressed not in their features, which were different enough, but in the particular way both of them inhabited their own bodies under difficult circumstances, as though they had each made a private decision that their bodies were theirs, and that no amount of external pressure was going to alter that fundamental arrangement. Judge Fenn spoke to Felix in a tone that was adjusted for his age without being adjusted for his intelligence, which was the correct calibration and which Felix recognized and responded to with the attention it deserved. He asked Felix to describe what he had done on the day he found the paper. Felix described it. He described it the way he had described it on the mountain trail with Nora that morning, in the even cadence of a person recounting a true thing, and what he said was consistent in every particular with what Nora had said, and the sequence of events was clear and the details were specific in the way that fabricated details are never quite specific, with the texture of actual memory rather than the smoothness of invention. He said he had gone out through Dottie's back because he wanted to see what Warren was doing in the lot. He said he had watched Warren from behind the fence. He said Warren had found something and looked at it and put it in his coat. He said after Warren left, he had gone into the lot and found the paper near where Warren had been standing a little further from that spot than he would have expected, as though the wind or something disturbing the ash had moved it. He said he had given it to his sister. He said he had kept the fact of it private because his sister had asked him to, until she knew what to do with it, and that he had kept it private because he trusted his sister's judgment, and because he was 7 years old at the time, and she had told him to, and that had been sufficient reason for him. Judge Fenn asked him one question. "Did you at any point," the judge said, "between finding the paper and today show it to anyone other than your sister, or discuss what you saw in that lot with anyone other than your sister?" Felix considered this with the thoroughness it deserved. "No, sir," he said. "Only Nora." Judge Fenn nodded once slowly. Then Dottie Marsh was invited to speak. She stood with the weight of what she was about to say visible in the set of her shoulders, not bowing her down, but present the way a heavy thing is present when a person has picked it up and is carrying it deliberately rather than being crushed by it. She said she had been awake on the night of the fire. She said she had been by her front window with her dog, who had been ill that week. She said she had seen the fire begin, or rather had seen the light of it from her window before she understood what it was, and she had gone to the window and looked out. She said she had seen Warren Aldine come out of the front door of his house. She said she had watched him walk to the far side of the yard away from the house before the fire had spread to the front rooms. Before, she said again, looking at the judge, before the front of the house was involved, before anyone who had gone out through the front would have been driven back by the fire. He came out and he walked away and he stood at the far fence and he watched. She said she had seen no one else come out of the front door. She said she had told herself she was not certain of what she saw. She said this had been untrue. She said she was certain and had been certain and had chosen not to say so for 3 years, and that she was saying so now, and that she was prepared to say so to any authority that asked her for as long as any authority wished to ask her, until the end of her life, if necessary. Judge Fenn looked at her for a long moment after she finished. "You understand," he said, "that this testimony combined with this document constitutes a serious matter requiring formal investigation and likely a full hearing at the district level." "I do," Dottie said. "And you stand by everything you have said here today?" "I stand by every word," Dottie said, "and by the 3 years I did not say them, for which I do not expect to be forgiven, but which I intend to spend the remainder of my life making insufficient amends for." The judge regarded her a moment longer. Then he turned to Warren Aldine. Warren had not looked up from the floor throughout any of this. His arms were still folded. His face had the quality of a man who has been holding a single expression for so long that it has stopped being an expression and has become simply the arrangement of his features, blank and fixed and pointed downward. Judge Fenn asked Warren if he wished to respond to what had been presented. Warren said nothing for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was smaller than the room, "I want a lawyer," which was in its way the only answer that could have confirmed everything. It was in this moment that Cole Pratt in the back row made his mistake. He had been quiet through the entire proceeding, which had cost him considerably, and he had maintained the necessary appearance of official neutrality right up until the moment Warren asked for a lawyer, and then something shifted in him. Some calculation completed itself in a way he had not anticipated, and he stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "I have concerns about the reliability of this testimony." Judge Fenn looked at him over his spectacles. "Deputy Pratt," he said, "the witnesses here have personal grievances against Mr. Aldine that call their objectivity into question. The boy is a child. The woman lived under Mr. Aldine's roof and worked in his household. Her objectivity in any matter concerning him is not credible. Mrs. Marsh has a long-standing social relationship with the family that introduces bias." The room was quiet. Gideon did not stand. He had made this decision before he came into the room, the decision to remain seated unless he was asked to speak, because he had understood that the greatest thing he could offer this proceeding was the evidence and the witnesses, and not himself, not the large man with the 8-year history with Cole Pratt, who would, if he rose to speak, make this into something with a different shape than the one it needed to have. It was Nora who spoke. She did not rise fully. She half turned in her chair toward Pratt, and she looked at him with those steady amber-brown eyes that had been measuring things since the auction platform, and she said calmly and clearly into the quiet room, "My mother is dead. My brother has no home. I have spent 3 years living in rooms I did not choose, working for people I would not have chosen, carrying evidence I was afraid to use because I knew what happened to women like me when they brought accusations against men like Warren Aldine before men like you. I am not here because I have a grievance. I am here because a document dated 2 weeks before the fire exists, and a 10-year-old boy found it, and a woman who lives across the street saw what she saw. Those are facts. They do not require my objectivity to be true." The room held this. Cole Pratt sat back down. Judge Fenn looked at him for a moment that was longer than comfortable. Then Gideon stood. He had not planned to stand. It was not part of the arrangement he had made with himself before entering the room. But he stood because there was something that needed to be said, and because the person to say it was him, not because he owed it to anyone in this room other than possibly himself and possibly a woman named Margaret, who had needed him to be standing at a specific moment 8 years ago and whom he had failed. He was not going to fail at a specific moment again. "Your Honor," he said, "I have information relevant to this proceeding that concerns not Mr. Aldine, but the deputy who has just questioned the reliability of these witnesses." Cole Pratt went very still in the back row. 8 years ago. Gideon said Cole Pratt, at that time a private citizen, acquired a parcel of river bottom land south of Copper Ridge through means that forced the owner's family from the property. The owner's family included a woman named Margaret Voss. I have documentation of the original deed, the disputed transfer, and a letter written by Margaret Voss before she left the territory describing what was done to her family and who did it. I have had this documentation for 8 years. I am offering it to this court today, not as part of the present matter, but as relevant to the question of whether the deputy who has just impugned these witnesses has standing to impugn anyone's reliability in this room. The documentation existed. He had kept it in the cabin in a tin box set into a cavity he had cut behind the largest stone of the fireplace, the kind of place that outlasted men and weather both for 8 years, because he had not been ready to use it, and had known someday he would need to be ready, and he had kept it the way. You keep something you are not done with yet, not out of planning but out of the knowledge that things reach their time when they reach it and not before. He set the documents on Judge Fenn's table, Margaret's letter on top. She had written it at the land office in Billings the day she left the territory, and left it in the clerk's care with instructions to deliver it to Gideon War if he ever came asking about the Voss land transfer. The clerk had found him on a supply run 3 months later and pressed it into his hands without commentary, which was the correct amount of commentary for such a thing, her handwriting pressing too hard every word certain of itself. The silence in the room was complete. Cole Pratt did not say anything. He looked at the documents on the table, and something moved across his face that was not a single emotion, but the rapid succession of several, and then he looked at his hands. Judge Fenn read the letter. He read it slowly and completely the way he read everything. Then he looked up at Cole Pratt. "Deputy," he said in a voice that contained no inflection whatsoever, and was because of that considerably more effective than any inflection it might have employed, "I am going to need you to remain in Harlan Creek for the duration of my time here. We will be having a separate conversation about this matter." Cole Pratt nodded. He did not look at Gideon. He did not look at Nora or Felix or Dottie. He looked at the floor, and in the angle of his head and the set of his shoulders there was something that was the distant beginning of the weight a man carries when he has been carrying a thing for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment when carrying it is no longer possible. Judge Fenn concluded the preliminary hearing. He confirmed that the matter of Warren Aldine would proceed to formal investigation at the district level, and that Warren was to remain in Harlan Creek under the deputy's supervision pending arraignment, which was a circumstance of considerable irony that no one in the room remarked upon. He confirmed that Nora's testimony and the document and Dottie's account would be entered into the formal record. He confirmed that Felix's testimony would be entered as well. Warren Aldine was escorted from the room by the judge's clerk because Cole Pratt was not available for the task in any way that served the dignity of the proceeding. The room began to move and breathe again. Felix came to Nora's side and she put her arm around him, and he leaned into it, and for a moment they were simply a sister and a brother standing together in a room that had just told them officially and on the record that what they had known for 3 years was true, and that someone with the authority to do something about it now knew it too. Dottie blew her nose into a handkerchief and looked at the ceiling and said, "Well," in the tone of a woman who has more to say but is choosing in this one moment to say only the single word that stands for all of it. Gideon stood at the side of the room. He had not moved since he sat back down. He was looking at Margaret's letter on the table, at the familiar handwriting, at the pressure of it on the page, and he was thinking about her and about the 8 years between the letter and today, and about the peculiar mathematics by which a failure, if you carry it long enough and honestly enough, can become the very thing that teaches you how not to fail again. He thought about the marks on the cabin wall. He thought that tonight, when he went back up the mountain, he was not going to make a mark. He had been counting wrong. He had been counting days as though they were a sentence, as though accumulation itself was the point, as though reaching a sufficient number of days would eventually produce an absolution he had not yet managed to earn. He understood now that this was not how it worked, that the marks were not a record of penance. They were a record of waiting for a moment to be different from the moment in the field, and the moment had come, and the marks were done. Nora was standing beside him. He had not heard her cross the room. She was simply there the way she had learned to be there on the mountain, at sufficient distance to not be an imposition and at sufficient closeness to be present. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Margaret's letter on the table, at the handwriting she had not seen before, but that she could read even from this distance, the particular pressure of it, the certainty. She was very sure of herself, Nora said quietly. "Yes," Gideon said, "that is a good quality." "It is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for the letter, for doing that here." He looked at her. "I should have done it 8 years ago," he said. She looked back at him with those steady eyes. "You did it today," she said. "That is the day it needed to be done." Outside the window of Dottie's back room, Harlan Creek was conducting its afternoon. People passed on the main road. A wagon went by. Somewhere a door opened and closed. The town was the same town it had been that morning and the morning before that, and every morning for the past 3 years, during which a woman had moved through it with her collar turned up and her face angled away, and it was also, as of this afternoon, a different place, a place in which a circuit judge's clerk was writing down in an official ledger a set of facts that would not be unwritten. And 2 men who had arranged things to their convenience for years were sitting with the knowledge that the arrangement was over. It was late afternoon by the time they came out of Dottie's back room into the main store. Dottie made coffee and sliced the apple pie that she had baked that morning in the anticipatory way that she baked things for occasions. She intended to see through to their conclusion, and the 4 of them sat at the round table near the window and drank the coffee and ate the pie, and the conversation, when it came, was not about what had just happened, but about the ordinary things that people talk about when the extraordinary thing is finished, and the ordinary is what they have and what they want. Felix talked about the stars. He had seen from the cabin window on Copper Ridge more stars than he had known existed, and he had questions about them that were specific and numerous, and that Gideon answered one at a time with the patience of a man who does not find questions an imposition. Dottie talked about her dog, who was better now than he had been on the night of the fire 3 years ago, but who had recently developed an opinion about the corner of her kitchen that she found difficult to reason with. Nora said very little, but she drank her coffee and ate her pie and sat at the table in Dottie's store in the afternoon light without her collar up and without her face turned away, and the scar along her neck caught the lamplight, the way all skin catches lamplight warmly as part of a face that belongs to a person rather than as a mark that defines one. When they left, the sun was low and the cold was settling in for the night, and the mountains above the valley were going purple at their ridges in the particular way they go purple when the light is leaving and taking its warmth with it. They would go back up to the cabin. Not because there was nowhere else to go, though that was also true. Because it was home now in the way that places become home, not through time alone, but through what happens inside them, through the accumulated weight of fires built and kettles filled and mornings survived and evenings arrived at, and all the small necessary transactions of two people learning to share a space without losing themselves in the sharing. Gideon helped Nora onto her horse. She did not need the help, and they both knew she did not need it, but he offered it, and she allowed it, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that has nothing to do with needing and everything to do with choosing. Felix was already on his horse, adjusting the oversized coat with the efficiency of a boy who has had several days of practice and has opinions now about the optimal positioning of a coat 2 sizes too big. They started for the North Road and the trail up to the ridge. At the edge of town, Nora stopped her horse. Gideon stopped beside her. She was looking back at the main road at the building on the south end where Cole Pratt's office was, at the square where the platform stood empty, at the town that had laughed at a burlap sack and everything it contained. She looked at it for a long time with the look of a person who is deciding what relationship they are going to have with the place going forward, what they are going to carry from it, and what they are going to leave behind. Then she turned her horse toward the mountain. She did not look back again. The trail went up through the pines and the evening settled around them in the particular way December evenings settle in Montana, completely and without ceremony, as though the dark has simply always been there and the light was the interruption. The horses knew the way. The cold was manageable with the right coat and the right company. Felix fell asleep on his horse before they reached the first switchback, which was a feat of trust and exhaustion that Gideon observed with something that had no precise name, but that lived in the vicinity of wonder. Nora reached over and steadied the boy gently, and he slept on undisturbed. They reached the cabin in the full dark, and Gideon built the fire, and Nora put Felix in his room and covered him with the quilt that Dottie had sent up with them, and then she came back and sat at the table, and Gideon sat across from her, and the fire built itself to warmth between them. It was quiet in the way the cabin was quiet when it held what it now held, which was not solitude, and had not been solitude for 3 weeks. After a while Nora said, without looking up from the fire, "What will happen to Cole Pratt?" "He will be investigated," Gideon said. "Judge Fenn is thorough. Whatever Pratt arranged 8 years ago will come out. What comes of it will depend on what can be proven and who is still around to prove it. Is Margaret still alive?" He looked at the fire. "I do not know," he said. "I have not known for 8 years." Nora was quiet for a moment. "If she is," she said, "she might want to know." He thought about this. He thought about Margaret's handwriting and the letter that had sat in a tin box behind the fireplace stone for 8 years, and the question of what a person owes to the past versus what they owe to the present, and whether those two debts can be paid simultaneously, or whether paying one requires releasing the other. "Yes," he said, "she might." Nora looked up from the fire. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him across 3 weeks and 2 mountains, and 1 back room proceeding, and a table of coffee and apple pie, the way she had been looking at him since the auction platform when she had decided to measure him honestly and had been arriving by gradual and unrushed degrees at her conclusion. "You are a different man than the one who did not speak in a field 8 years ago," she said. He held her eyes. "I am the same man," he said. "I just finally did the thing I should have done." She considered this. "Maybe that is what different means," she said. The fire burned. The mountain held its peace outside. Above the ridge, invisible to anyone in the valley below, the stars were assembled in their full December inventory, countless and indifferent and very beautiful. After a while Nora said, "I would like to stay here, if that is still the arrangement." "It is still the arrangement," he said. She nodded once with the small precision that she brought to nods that meant something. He thought about 2 cups on a table that had only ever held one. He thought about the knife on the right side of the shelf. He thought about the gloves set out without comment and worn without discussion, and the morning the fire was already built when he came in from the traps. He thought about Felix's voice coming from the back of the cabin at odd hours, filling the space that silence had occupied for 8 years with something that was after a period of adjustment. He was finding shorter than expected considerably better than silence. He thought that he was going to stop making marks on the wall. Not because the counting was over exactly, but because what he had been counting toward had arrived quietly and without ceremony, the way real things arrive, not in the form he had imagined, if he had imagined it at all. Not dramatic or sudden or announced, but simply present in the way that warmth is present when a fire has been burning long enough to reach the walls. He did not say any of this. He was not a man who said things that did not need to be said, and she was not a woman who needed them said. Outside Copper Ridge held its high, cold silence, the same silence it had held for 8 years, for 100 years before that. For longer than the territory had a name, or the valley below had a town, or any of the particular human arrangements that had assembled themselves, this December had existed to be arranged. The mountain did not know what had changed inside the cabin at its foot. Mountains do not know such things. But if you had been standing on the trail below the cabin that night, looking up at the single lit window in the dark, you would have seen the warm glow of the fire behind the glass, and the 2 shapes seated at the table inside it, and the small shape visible in the doorway to the back room where a boy was sleeping, the uncomplicated sleep of someone who has eaten a full meal and been placed in a warm bed by someone who loves him. And you would have thought, if you were the kind of person who thinks such things, that whatever had been broken in that cabin before was not broken now, that it was, in fact, the opposite of broken, that it was, as of this December evening on Copper Ridge in the Montana Territory in the year of 1884, precisely what it was always supposed to be, which was home.